We're presenting the ITF Transport Outlook 2017. The last version was published in 2015, so new things to tell. I have with me José Vegas, the Secretary General of ITF, Jari Kaupila, the Head of Modeling and Statistics chez nous, and Vincent Benezek, who's the project leader for the Outlook, who will be presenting you the findings of the Outlook. Let me just very quickly say that we're webcasting this live, so this will be in English to make this accessible to as many people as possible. Most of us speak French, so you can ask questions in French, but they won't be translated. So if they can wait until after the webcast, maybe that would be an option. Without further ado, I pass the word to Jose, and hope you will enjoy this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon to all of you. The Transport Outlook is a flagship publication of the ITF. It's something on which we concentrate significant resources and which is also an opportunity for us to put in perspective all the other work we do, because it touches upon all our components of work in a forward-looking perspective at some distance. As Michael said, this was last done 2 years ago. In principle, this is a 2-year cycle. Maybe this year we will need to do a 1-year update if the announced changes are as strong and deep as they seem to be, although we don't yet know in what directions they will be. There may be an Outlook 2018, we will see. It is something which we make the point of saying is not presenting forecast or forecasts. We are presenting projections under different scenarios. So we have the trends from the past, and we put them together with some scenarios of how the policies may be in the future. Of course, for the sake of readability and understandability, the number of such scenarios is limited. We tend to have them relatively extreme within the realm of realism to give you an idea of the range of values we could be expecting. My colleagues will be making most of the presentation, but I would want to say something on that exercise, which is that, as you will see, even the most ambitious scenarios we have here fall short of a significant reduction of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in transport. So the world will have to be bolder than what currently is seen as realistic. The second important message is that technology alone, in particular powertrain technology alone, is not enough. We need to have other areas of intervention. It can be in regulation, it can be on fiscal policy, it can be on integration with land use, but more will be needed. Technology alone is not enough, and especially not fast enough to get there. And all of this puts together essentially brings the key message, which is transport policy matters. This is not a question. If we take the question of climate change seriously, and the question of congestion seriously, it's not only about technologies. It is about policies. And we have collectively as societies, we have to have the courage to identify what are the necessary policies and to bring the persuasion, the arguments in favor of those policies to our citizens and have them democratically accepted. But too often we hear speeches about the wonders of technology and that will save the world. The message here is very clear. It's not enough. And we need to have the courage to take stronger policies. When you will see the report, you will understand why I'm saying that. I'm not bringing all the numbers, but Vincent in particular will bring you some graphics which support what I've just been saying. This is, if you compare this with the Transport Outlook 2015, it's a significantly deeper analysis. we've been able to get our team bigger and covering more competences. So I'm very proud of the work we've been able to do this year. This was done under the leadership of Jari Kaupila, the head of statistics and modeling. We've been putting together a strong modeling team. And one of the first to come in that team was Vincent Benezek, the project manager for this project. I will be now passing the word to Jari. He will say a few words about cooperation with other institutions, which is very important. We are an institution very open to collaboration in many fronts. And then he will pass the word to Vincent. At the end, all of us will be available for questions. Jari.
Thank you very much, José, and good afternoon also on my behalf. Welcome, everybody, to this launch event. I just want to very briefly say a couple of words on the transport outlook. As José was saying, it relies on in-house models that we today cover all modes of transport, both freight and passenger, looking at urban, non-urban, global freight, domestic freight, aviation, etc. So we really cover all the transport modes in the outlook. And you have the publication on your desk. I think we have several copies in the room. We will also make available the presentation that Vincent will be making on paper copies available for everybody to take with, and with a few notes perhaps on the more detailed numbers on behind that. But the point that I really want to make is that even though it's done with the in-house models, this really is a collaborative effort. So this is with the colleagues in the ITF, but also broadly with the OECD. Several directors have been involved in this work, with the IEA, International Energy Agency, using their technology assumptions, a lot of the work done in collaboration with them, and more broadly with several stakeholders, academia, researchers around the world. And I think from the acknowledgement page you see in the beginning that there's a really wide range of experts that we work with on this report. And I think with that, I just want to give the floor to Vincent.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for being here. And so I would like to present the main points of this outlook, but with this presentation I will have a very strong focus on CO2 emissions. So this is because it is a very important subject to us, but I would like to stress the fact that the outlook is not just about CO2 emissions, and we'd be happy to have any question related to the other parts of the work at the end. So why this strong focus on CO2 emissions here? I would like to give maybe a couple of background information to this. The first one is maybe looking at the emissions and the historical emissions. And in the OECD economies, transport remains the fastest growing sector in terms of CO2 emission. If you compare to industry as a whole, energy as a whole, or the total transport, it is the fastest growing. And it only started to decrease in 2007, 2008. So this is, as the other sectors, on the occasion of the economic crisis, which was also combined with very high oil prices at the time. And so if you look at the latest figures, so from 2014 and 15 that are available for some countries, especially in the European Union, now we have very low oil prices, so the emissions are growing again. So this stresses that the transport sector is an extremely difficult sector to decarbonize, and even in the countries which should have the means to do more effort towards this, it seems to be a very difficult task. So this is looking at the OECD. Maybe now we can look at we can compare OECD with non-OECD. And non-OECD economies per capita, they emit 6 times less CO2 emissions. So the emissions from transport is 0.5 tons per capita and per year, compared to 3.0 for the OECD economies. So this is likely to close, this gap is likely to close in the future, and this is more because the non-OECD economies will develop than because the OECD economies will become more efficient. And in the future, this will be another significant challenge, is how to tackle the growing emissions from the non-OECD economies. And maybe to show the extent of the challenge, we can look at the numbers in terms of passenger transport volumes and later freight. And the global transport volumes will continue to expand in the scenarios that we have. So this is the baseline scenario. So the baseline scenario is our reference case, which shows how transport will develop if we assume a continuation of the trends in terms of policies, fuel efficiency, and so on. And so the passenger transport volume that we have here on the left side, they actually doubled between 2015 and 2050. And as you can see in the dark blue element of the bars, it is actually coming much more from the non-OECD economies than from the OECD economies. So this corresponds to the passenger transport, and just in the green side, you also have a significant increase of the international mode, which for passenger is the aviation. So it is a quadrupling of aviation, and I will go back to this a bit later. Now looking at the freight transport volume, we have a doubling for the freight sector, it's actually a tripling, so plus 230%. And again, this growth takes place in non-OECD economy, especially for the freight sector. Here, in terms of international transport, so it's mostly maritime and aviation, but it's mostly maritime, of course, and it is also growing significantly as well. So now, if we turn this transport demand that we have evaluated looking at the economic growth, at a lot of other factors, into CO2 emissions, this is what we find. So despite the large efficiency gains that we assume in the baseline scenario, there is still a 60% increase in the CO2 emissions from transport between 2015 and 2050. And an important element is that, so currently emissions from transport are around equally divided between freight and passenger, but the freight sector is likely to grow much more and to represent around 60% in 2050. So this is the baseline scenario. This is somehow the background to what I will show next. And I would like to delve a bit deeper into some of the sectors that we have studied in the Outlook and explain a bit more what's going on in these sectors and what are the potential mitigation measures and their impact. So I'll be looking at three sectors, so international freight, international passenger aviation, and also the mobility in cities. So first, looking at international freight, so this is the freight that comes from international trade. So we are starting this work using trade data and trade projections that is produced by the OECD and trying to assess what will be the impact of this trade onto the freight sector. And the numbers that I will show, which are still extremely high, they are despite the fact that since 2015 we have revised our GDP growth downwards, we have revised the trade elasticity, so the trade volumes downwards, but we still have a very significant growth. So I think one of the main points that we have in our projections is the global shift in freight patterns. So there is a number of elements that show that we will have a completely different freight patterns in 2050 compared to 2015. So first of all links related with Asia will grow very quickly and very significantly and much more than all the other corridors. So for instance, the North Pacific corridor, it will be twice the equivalent of the North Atlantic corridor in 2050, even though they're currently approximately the same amount. Similarly, for intra-Asian freight, so international but intra-Asia, we have a 350% increase in freight demand. So anything related to Asia, so this also includes the Indian Ocean. So the Indian Ocean is both the trade between Asia and Africa, but also the trade between Asia and Europe going through the Suez Canal. Anything like this will significantly grow compared to the other corridors. What this implies is that the emissions from freight will also be shifting. And this is especially because intra-Asian freight relies on trucks because the rail infrastructure there is not suited for international freight. And this is why we have very strong growth in CO2 emissions from intra-regional freight. For instance, in Asia, it's plus 210% for intra-Asian freight alone. Another significant element of the freight projections is the concentration of CO2 emissions in hinterland connections. So by hinterland connections, we mean anything that is transported between the port and the cities or between the factories and the ports or airports. So anything that is the domestic part of the international freight. And while this only represents 7% of the international freight in terms of ton kilometers, so in terms of volumes, it represents 30% of the total trade-related CO2 emissions. And so this element is very significant, but it also offers some hope, both because it can be addressed in terms of national policies. So tackling these emissions will not require any complex international agreement, but also because this freight, which happens in the domestic, it's very significant cost for the freight forwarders. So it represents up to 80% of total trade-related costs. So the total trade-related transport costs. And so decreasing these emissions is a win-win situation because it decreases the emissions, but it also decreases the cost for the truck companies and for the freight forwarders. So having said that, we can look at what this means in terms of emissions, and we can try and assess what can be the efficient policies to decrease the CO2 emissions from freight. So here we have, again, the baseline scenario, which is the second bar. Compared to the 2015, we have an increase of around 100%. And so first, if we apply higher fuel efficiency and higher shares of alternative fuels, we can reduce the freight CO2 emissions by 40%. And so this is by applying scenarios that are on which we are working with the International Energy Agency. So this corresponds to another more efficient scenarios that they have. But this is not enough to tackle the road sector. You still have an increase in emissions from the freight sector. And it is necessary to introduce more operational efficiency measures to tackle the road freight sector. And there we have tested a range of measures with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, which are very interested in looking at what are the operational measures coming from, for instance, truck sharing, route optimization, or relaxing of delivery windows in cities, and what can be the impact of these measures at the global level. And we find that this can reduce the CO2 emissions from the road sector by a further 35%. So this is only looking at international freight, but just saying one word about the overall global freight, because these measures can apply to any surface freight. They have the potential to reduce the freight CO2 emissions by 50% overall, especially in cities where route optimization, truck asset sharing, and delivery window relaxing is very important. So this is the first estimation that we have, but the World Business Council is currently working on prototyping these different solutions to look at the real-world impact of these measures. I will now move on to the second element, which is international passenger aviation. So this is another area with significant growth, with actually, in the baseline scenario that we have, a quadrupling of demand by 2050. So this may look extremely large, but if actually corresponds to an annual growth rate of 4.1%, which is lower than what we have seen in the previous decade. So between 2005 and 2015, the annual growth rate was around 5%, and this is only because of the economic crisis. Otherwise, it would be much higher. So this already corresponds to an assumed decrease in the growth rate of air passenger demand. So where does this come from? So, of course, it comes from the economic development in non-OECD countries, as for the other sectors, but it also comes from the very large expected expansion of the air network. So this can be facilitated by liberal air regulation, and it really reinforces the growth of air passenger demand. Another extremely significant element there is the growth of intra-regional passenger demand. So this is something that we have witnessed already in Europe through the large development of point-to-point and especially low-cost carriers. And in other developing regions, this is likely to come in the next 10 to 20 years, and this will significantly increase the demand for intra-regional passenger demand. So one big issue for aviation is that the energy efficiency improvement we can expect will not be in line with the growth in passenger demand. So what has the improvement that we have seen in the 10 years is not sufficient to mitigate the growth in passenger demand. So the International Civil Aviation Organization has already brokered a breakthrough deals with its members to keep the emissions from 2020 at their 2020 level, so from there onwards, but it's only a medium-term solution. So on the longer term, there is an industry commitment to bring aviation emissions to half the 2005 level by 2050. And the main element to reach that target is the introduction of biofuels. So according to our calculations, this will require between 70 to 100% of planes to be powered by biofuel in 2050, and this depends on the carbon content of these biofuels. This is, of course, it has a lot of potential, but there are very large uncertainties regarding to the availability of these biofuels. So currently the production is minimal, and also to the price of these biofuels. At the moment, it is economically not sustainable. It costs between 5 and 10 times more than conventional oil. And so there is a lot of research and development to bring the cost of these fuels in line with conventional fuel so that it becomes economically attractive. Another issue is that this is the plan for aviation, but other transport modes, such as maritime, are also counting on biofuels, and this reinforces the problem with the availability. So will there be enough biofuels to power all this transport? It is a big question. Moving to the last part of the presentation, I will look at the mobility in cities. So it actually constitutes a significant share of the outlook. We have devoted a lot of effort towards this part because the mobility in cities will bring significant challenges, not only for CO2 emissions, but also for accessibility. So again, starting from the demand, we see that in all the scenarios that we have, demand is likely to double approximately between 2015 and 2050. And 80% of this growth will come from developing economies. So growth of the cities, urbanization, economic development of the cities, of the developing economies. So on this graph on the left side is the transport demand in 2015. The second one is the baseline scenario for 2050. And the last one is a low carbon scenario where we introduced a set of measures that comprises pricing, so pricing of parking, pricing of oil, pricing, all different sorts of pricing measures, a reassignment of funding towards more public transport supply, and also some more strengthened land use policies. And if you apply these policies, we find that the same mobility levels or even higher can be satisfied by limiting the growth in car use, by actually keeping it constant from 2015. And also, the demand that is not fulfilled by car will be fulfilled by public transport. In this one, the green one is, so it's essentially two-wheelers, so motorbikes. And this is it's also decreasing in the low carbon scenario, which relies less on motorbikes because of the decrease in congestion. The impact of these measures can be, of course, seen in terms of CO2 emission. So this compares the baseline and the low carbon scenario for the CO2 emissions in cities. And what we see is that the right policies, so the policies that I mentioned for the previous slide, can decrease the CO2 emissions in cities by around 30% compared to an increase in the baseline scenario. And if we track down where this decrease comes from, we have 70% from technology, so this means improved CO2 efficiency, higher shares of alternative fuel, and 30% from behavior changes, so essentially modal shifts. That being said, this does not mean that technology alone can bring 70%, because a lot of this additional mitigation coming from technology relies on the fact that people will change to buses, and these buses will become more efficient. So just putting people into buses, which is the only solution in a lot of medium-sized cities, is not enough to curb the emissions. So another effect that we have in the low-carbon scenario is on accessibility. So we have looked at how accessibility is likely to provide it in the different scenarios. And we see that in the baseline, where there is a huge reliance on cars, the road expansion that is needed to keep accessibility constant is not sustainable. So it actually requires a quadrupling of the road provision, and this is only in Asian cities where the growth is the highest. And at contrary, if you apply the policies of the low-carbon scenario, by 2050, the same amount of road can actually provide the same amount of accessibility. And this is because there is less congestion, so the travel times are lower, but also because less people require the use of cars and actually use the public transport. So this means that you have a lot of the accessibility that needs to be provided by public transport. And there, it is important to stress that urban mobility is about providing access to opportunities, and good access to public transport is not necessarily the same as good access to jobs. So on this slide, on the left part, you have on the left part of the graph the percentage of population which is less than 1,000 kilometers away from a public transport stop. So this measures the coverage of the public transport network in these 23 cities for which we could do the computation. And on the right side, this is the share of the inhabitants of the city who are accessible by a 30-minute public transport trip. And this is for an average person in the city. And this measures more accessibility. And the two have actually a low degree of correlation. So you can have very good public transport coverage with actually very low accessibility levels. And this reinforces the need to shift urban transport policies toward access to opportunities and not towards access to public transport. To conclude this presentation, I would like to present again the emissions, but now looking at the low carbon scenario, which combines the most optimistic scenarios from all the different sectors which I have presented and some others which I didn't have the time for. And this is to illustrate the message that Jose gave at the beginning of this of this presentation, that currently foreseeable policies will not be enough to achieve the climate ambitions. So in the low carbon scenario, we have actually a stagnation of emissions from transport at the levels of 2015, and they stay at around 7.5 gigatons of CO2 per year. And there is an urgent need for accelerated innovation and radical policy choices. And there are a few options that are already on the table and that may need to be strengthened, but there are also options that would need to be invented. And among these that are on the table, we can think of shared mobility, radical changes in the way supply chains are built, or maybe a hypothetical new mode. To conclude, maybe again, so this is our assessment of the policies in terms of CO2 emissions, but transport policies need to be looked at from a much broader angle and looking at the impact on the transport sector as a whole and also on the economy as a whole. And this is especially true now that the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals, have been launched. It's essential to look at the policies in terms of their impact of these SDGs. So this can be accessibility. We've looked a bit at this, but this can also be road safety, for instance, or freight connectivity. I would like to finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, Jose, and Yari. We're taking questions. If you could, A, identify yourselves, B, press the button, because we're casting, we need the microphone, and be brief. Those are the three kind of elements I would ask you to respect. And I see someone in the second line. Could you maybe use one of the microphones? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Florence Flus from the Center for Tax Policy and Administration. I have two questions. The first question is, when I talk with our colleagues from TAT, that they tell me a lot of freight transport currently, a lot of the volume is the transport of fossil fuels. If we decarbonize our economies, electricity sector and so on, I assume that the transport of oil and coal and so on is no longer necessary. So I wanted to know, kind of like, when you made your scenarios, did you take this into account, or is it more like a linear projection? Second, you said this is not about forecast, this is a scenario. I haven't seen this in this report, but I was interested whether for the future you would maybe take a different starting point, not looking at what are the policies that we see today and what do they imply, but more look at kind of like, we know what we agreed to in the Paris Agreement, what would we need to do to come actually to zero in 2050 and 2060, and then say, okay, we may need to completely electrify certain sectors and so on, or what would be the policy needs. It would just be interesting whether this was discussed and whether these are plans for the future.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Let me try to answer the first one. Indeed, we did not look at specifically impact of energy production and changes in energy production and how those would affect the supply chains. But we did actually in the report. There's actually a chapter named "Decision Making Under Uncertainty," and this really goes back to these kind of questions. So, what will happen if we have today a large share of current global trade is really flows of coal and oil? What would happen if we really go to the decarbonizing the energy system? How those might affect the flows? We don't have yet answers to that, but we really discussed that as well. Similarly, there are changes in the supply chain configurations. We've been seeing some examples or some evidence of nearshoring instead of offshoring, which again might play differently for the future projections. What are the production patterns? What are the consumption patterns of future population? All these questions are points that we don't have the evidence yet necessarily, but we really call the attention to making the decision under these uncertainties that you have in place, and I think they're extremely important questions, definitely.
Let me pick up on the second one. We are looking here at what is possible under what we could call non-radical policy evolutions. And it is important, at least in this first step, to be perfectly clear that just more of the same kinds of policies is not enough. Waiting or expecting miracles from just the powertrain technologies is not enough. So what could we do? That was essentially your question. And this is a discussion we've had in the framework of our Decarbonizing Transport project, in which we took a lesson from the failure of the Copenhagen COP meeting, in which a number of organizations tried to tell the countries, you have to do this. And what did the countries do? No. We will not follow your orders. We are sovereign countries. So what we are doing is building a complex array of possible measures, what we are calling a catalog of measures, and we want to make our capacity available to the countries and to industries for them to work with us and discover their own approach. It will be longer, but it has a better chance of being adopted. We are simply not recognized, and probably rightly so, as having the right to say to the countries what they should do. If our technical competence and, I would say, common sense are recognized, we would like to be used by the countries to find where is the intersection of the effectiveness on greenhouse gas reductions and domestic political acceptance, because all these governments want to be re-elected. And that's the way we are approaching it. Coming up on just as a complement to this answer, in the agreements at the COP21, as you know, the countries had to present their nationally determined commitments. If you look at them, barely half of them mention transport measures, but half of those that mention transport, they do not have measures. They have aspirations. We will double the percentage of public transport, but they don't say how. We will reduce this, but they don't say how. So we cannot build on that without some dialogue with the countries who wrote this kind of commitments. And it's good that they did something. They showed a commitment to reach certain results, but they presented much more the targets than the approaches to get there. So we believe a technically independent, competent instrument is necessary, but we have to respect the sovereignty of those countries. And the independence of the companies will also have to make a lot of decisions and be available to support them. So that's why we are not doing a backcasting exercise to say what is it needed to get there. It will be the summation of all those many contributions, with each country, each large company, finding out what is the room, the space they have, that, as I said, is at the same time effective technically and politically acceptable.
Thank you very much, Jari. Josie, any other questions? Yes, I can see questions over here. Can you use this maybe?
Yes, no problem. Hi, Manasuni Vaidula from the Climate Change Expert Group in the OECD. So one of my questions, have you been able to look at the drivers for policymakers, especially in developing countries and maybe OECD countries as well, to review their current transport policies and to raise ambition? And the second question is, I've been seeing, I don't have much information on this, but I've been seeing there's more concern about the associated emissions that can come from growing more crops for biofuels, because you'd have to clear the land to grow these crops. And so what is the conversation, just if you could summarize it, on this that is going on, and what are the maybe solutions that some people in the transport sector are arriving at? Thank you.
I think the first thing that we recognize is the absolute need to pass the message that there is no magic wand. Too many political leaders believe that electrifying all our cars is enough. Those that study a little more, they say, okay, and then biofuels for aviation and maritime. This is a simplistic approach. So what we believe is our first mission is to bring solid evidence of the limitations of those approaches, and then offer the catalog. But we don't want to be preaching, because we know that preaching to political leaders is normally not well received. Let me put it so. We hope to develop this method saying we are available, we want to work with you, and we can help you in bilateral dialogue what seems that would be working in your case, but it has to be your choice, not ours. So we take a very humble position, because we believe that if we come as kind of a commanding voice, the effect will be very negative.
Maybe another perspective to that as well, in terms of the perception of the emerging economies compared to the OECD economies, for example. At least on the transport sector, I think that a lot of the cities in emerging economies are tackling much more on the local pollutant questions rather than the CO2 emission as a political priority. The congestion, road safety, accessibility, really access to opportunities is extremely important. And one of the things we want to do in our work, and also you'll see in the outlook as well, we've not only looked at the CO2 emissions, but we really try to identify the policy packages that can deliver co-benefits. And so attracting that discussion to those issues that are relevant for the cities or for the countries that we're discussing with. So I think the approach can be somewhat different to countries, depending on the country, as you probably know as well.
Yeah.
So just briefly on the second point around the biofuels. So from where I understand, so the biofuels that are currently used it's much more the blended. It's also biofuel blended with petrol. So for instance, in Brazil, they have a very high rate of blending of biofuel. And this is not the kind of biofuels that aviation and maritime are looking at. So they're looking at second or even third generation, what they call biofuel. So this is why it's also very uncertain, the availability of these biofuels, because it's even now technically not very sound, and we don't know how much will be available. So they are looking at algae, but this is not at all available yet. They're looking at biomass, so from residuals and so on. But this is why it's still a work in progress for these two elements. But they're not looking at biofuels from sugarcane, for instance, or for this kind of stuff that competes from food crops. Yes. Sorry.
Just behind you.
Thank you, Jean-Marc Fournier from the Economics Department. I just have one question on electric cars. And the point is that, I'm not an expert in this field, so what I had seen just in the press, for instance, is that there are major car makers that say that electric cars will have a decrease in prices, and they anticipate break-even in the really very near future. We know also that self-driving cars is technology that is proving quite sharply. I had seen the presentation by someone who was, cannot reform it as he did, but was an expert in this field, was anticipating that there would be a massive shift toward, self-driving electric cars. But just, why all these analyses, and especially these major car makers, would be wrong in saying that you could have a massive shift toward electric cars because prices would just become lower, not because technology will become relevant, not because of policy action. Thank you.
We have looked, and then Yari and Vincent can complement that. We have looked not only at the announced expectations of the major car makers, but also at what is normally called the penetration curves of the different technologies. And it's not enough to have the cars available. You have to have the grid infrastructure available and the charging points available. And for instance, for all the people who live in apartments without an individual garage, you have to have a solution where they can recharge their cars. So there's a lot of additional conditions to have those cars operating and acceptable by the people. It's not that trivial. So the system is a little more complex. There's a lot of infrastructure which we take for granted in the case of gasoline and diesel, which is not yet there for those. And then there is the huge legacy of other cars. Electric cars have this very interesting thing, of course, which is that the variable cost per kilometer if taxation does not change too much, is much, much lower than gasoline cars. Yes, that will make them much more attractive for first buyers. What happens to the residual value of the gasoline cars? As second-hand, they will be even cheaper than today. And I don't know whether you are aware, but in any country, France, 2/3 of the cars in circulation are not new cars. They have already been bought as second and third and fourth hand cars. So all that market, it's 2/3. The combustion engine cars will not disappear overnight because their commercial value will also get lower. We have to take all of that into account for the penetration curves. Even if we take for granted all that fantastic evolution that they're saying about the availability. I've seen others that say lithium is going to increase a lot on the price, so maybe making the car is cheaper, but getting the batteries is more expensive. So there are conflicting stories out there. But even if it is taken as good that they will be cheaper, we still have to consider the rest of the ecosystem of the car and what happens to the millions and hundreds of millions of combustion engine cars that are out there and which will lose value in terms of selling them out.
Just on the electric vehicles, and we're definitely not saying that that's not a solution. We've been looking at, in our low carbon scenario, we have quite a significant penetration of electric vehicles in the fleet already, and assuming that these will be taking place. There are two additional points to the existing fleet. In addition to that, the electric vehicles probably are more likely solution for cities with shorter distances, but there's still a significant amount of long-distance passenger transport, also by private cars. How much of that can be moved to trains or buses that run on a low-carbon fuels is a question. And as Vincent was saying in the beginning, one of the reasons actually is that we see the freight sector becoming the largest emitting, is that is also long distance trucks, etc. So how do we tackle that question is one additional point. You mentioned autonomous cars, self-driving cars. We've actually looked at that in another body of our work, and also we briefly mentioned that work in the Outlook as well. In our understanding, a lot of the benefits for CO2 reduction and for the transport system itself doesn't come really so much from the self-driving aspect, but it's come from the sharing aspect. So if these fleets can be shared, that's where the benefits could come. And then we've done some work on the city of Lisbon and working on other cities where we found out that you could actually provide the same mobility as today with only 3% of the vehicles needed if they were all shared. So I think there's just kind of a distinction I want to make.
Thank you.
Just one clarification, then to what extent this car sharing, that was exactly the point that I had heard, that, you could mix like Uber technology with, self-driving cars and something like that. But then to what extent car sharing is included in your scenario?
Yes.
So it is not included in the scenarios at the moment, but it is something that we are working on, because we only have very preliminary evidence on the benefits that can come from this car sharing, but we are looking at other cities, other type of urban developments, other types of mobility patterns to try and infer what can be the potential of car sharing in diverse urban environments, and then this will be included in our future scenarios for the outlook. So at the moment we only have marginal improvements of the load factors in cars, which could potentially be attributed to more car sharing, but it's not on a very wide scale.
Other questions? Please raise your hand. I can't see everybody that well. Yes, please.
So I'm Olivier Durand-Lasserre from the Economics Department. I have a question because we saw that for urban transportation in the scenario with decarbonization, you have less investment in roads, if I understand. So I guess that on the other hand, you need to invest more in mass public transportation, including maybe in some means that are more costly. So my question is just, I understand that this is way more subtle than that, but whether there is overall a decrease in the total cost of urban transportation in the case of decarbonization, or whether this cost is bound to increase, and what are the main drivers, road infrastructure, the stock of transportation infrastructure, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. It's a very important and interesting one. I cannot fully answer it right now. It's actually some work that we are also doing to extend the work of the Outlook, is to look at the different the costs of the different scenario and the cost for the different stakeholders. I think it's difficult to answer the question on a very general basis because it depends who is paying and what kind of costs you are taking into account, whether the cost of driving for personal individuals is also there or if it's just the cost of investment in infrastructure. But preliminary evidence suggests that actually a scenario where you have more urban transport is cheaper overall than a scenario where you still use the road transport. And I think there will be more of this in the upcoming G20 work by the OECD, to which some of our colleagues have participated in.
We have 5 more minutes. Please.
The economics department again, I'm afraid. My name is Andres Fuentes. If I got your presentation correctly, there will be the contribution of international trade to CO2 emissions will increase. I wonder whether you have a view as to the impact on foreign trade if you do the policies that are needed to decarbon international trade and to price carbon emissions in this sector.
That's a good question, and I have to say this is one of the other things we really want to look at more and more. At the moment, the way our freight model, international freight model, works is that we look at we use the OECD-wide trade projections as a starting point, and then we look at how that trade converts to a movement of freight, and by which mode, and so on and so forth. We don't have yet the feedback loop back to the trade, which we would be very much interested in working with the colleagues at the OECD to make that loop and look at what is an impact of not only the CO2 emission policies, but also what is an impact of congestion, impact of not investing to the port capacities in the regions where the port capacities will be growing in the future, and so on. So what are the sort of feedback loops back to the trade growth rates and the GDP growth as well? This is something that we are already working and started working in the margins of the Decarbonizing Transport project, where we want to look at much more of the system performance as well, rather than just the transport sector. So it is part of our program of work for the next year as well, or this year actually.
Joaquin Guillot from STI. One of the slides present about the share of internal transportation in the countries in the emission of CO2 is very high, and probably underdeveloped countries, developing countries, is mainly because of the lack of infrastructure. Have you looked at, because it's in some way it's good to tell the countries, but have you looked at the way to finance this change in the infrastructure? Because somehow the countries, it's easy to just put a road inside of building a highway or a waterway system, and this of course takes a lot of money, investments, and these countries are not able. Have you looked at the ways to finance actually this changing infrastructure?
Not yet, but this is part of our dialogue with the multilateral development banks. These banks now have in their mandate that all loans and grants have to, on the transport sector, have to include a component of how that plays in relation to sustainable transport. And some of these banks have been talking to us, asking that we would be providing that kind of analysis, so that for those investments, this would be possible. In any case, it must be said, it is not viable to assume that all that freight would be transported by rail, because sometimes the density along particular lines makes railway not cleaner than road because of the emissions that you have just to put the infrastructure and then the rolling stock. But there is a substantial potential for mode transfer. This has to be done in relation to the new investments, and we believe the best way to tackle that is to be working in collaboration with the multilateral development banks, through which most of that investment is carried out anyway.
I think we can take one more question. We have 3 minutes. That should be okay. We have gentlemen.
Louis Guarino from French L'Officiel des Transporteurs magazine. I have a question about the link between innovation and radical policy choices to decarbonize transport. And what do you think about the European Commission scenario, which leads to test on RDE, real driving emissions, and it's perhaps a mean to reduce carbon in Europe? What do you think about this policy?
I don't know the details of that policy. I don't even know to what extent the countries will be accepting that. For the moment, that is, to the best of my knowledge, only a suggestion or a proposal by the Commission. And I've been in this area long enough to know that there can be a substantial gap between the intentions of the Commission and the actual actions by the countries. A lot of this, in the end, has to come to bringing the evidence forward and then finding a few countries which are willing to lead. And if those things perform good results, then others will come and copy. I do not believe at this stage that the fact that the Commission says, let's do this, will really bring the countries to do this. So maybe it's a good idea. Maybe some countries will want to take it forward, and if they do and the results are good, then there is a good chance. Just bringing the proposal forward is only the first step, and it's probably a good first step. But I would not be too enthusiastic about that or any other first step coming, again, from the top. It's, again, this question of why I believe we don't want to be prescriptive.
Thank you very much, Jose, Yari, and Vincent. Thank you very much for coming. This was very interesting 60 minutes. I would like to invite those colleagues from the journalism front who are here, if they would like to stay a little bit, ask questions in French, because now I know all of you are French. The Americans didn't make it. Feel free to come and talk to Jose and Yari and Vincent for a couple of minutes. Dear OECD colleagues, thank you for being here. And transport is something that is by definition horizontal and touches on almost everything I can think of. And if this has helped a little bit to kind of, put this on your radar screens, that would be great. And we're certainly open, I think, to kind of continue that discussion. Thank you for coming, and see you around somewhere. Thanks.
Thank you.